I can just speak. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Vitek, and on behalf of the West Virginia University College of Law, I'm thrilled to welcome you to the first of our lecture series this year called the McDougall Global Perspectives Lecture Series. Sorry, there's a little flashback from the mic, but I think that's corrected. We are delighted to bring you to our community here a series of lecture speakers who will share with us their perspectives on global issues that are being discussed in the world today. Our goal is to offer you a range of diverse perspectives about these legal issues and to engage our community in a discussion regarding those issues. As you know, the law school offers a range of international law programs, from our international law course offerings to our summer programs of study in Brazil and in Mexico, and through our immigration law clinic, grown by our professor and colleague Jim Friedberg. In addition, through the generosity of donations made on behalf of Archibald McDougall, we have the opportunity to bring to our community visiting legal scholars from around the world to teach classes ranging from Mexican family law to international human rights. And two of those professors, Miant Zahn and Fernando Patron, are going to be joining us and presenting the second and third lectures in this series. Through the efforts of Dean McDonnell, Joyce this is McDougall and McDonnell. It is just, there's a commonality there. Through Dean Joyce McConnell's generous efforts, time, and energy, we are pleased to offer this series. Again, it's dedicated to bringing international lawyers and legal scholars who will present a diverse range of viewpoints. I'd just like to thank Joyce McConnell for her generous efforts and resources to make this possible. I'd also like to thank Brian Caudill, our Director of Communications, Margaret Obush, our PR specialist, Keith Walton and Louis Mackley for their IT support. All of them have dedicated tremendous amounts of time, and without their work, we wouldn't be having this lecture today. I'd also like to thank the Women's Law Caucus, who is helping host this event. So today, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you our first series speaker, Hala Shawaibi. I am mispronouncing her name, I know, but I can't manage the Arabic vowel that is supposed to go with her last name. So she said that this is a decent interpretation of Shawaibi, and I'm working on my Arabic. Ms. Shawaibi is a resident of Ramallah, a city on the West Bank of the Palestinian-occupied territories. She comes to us having while being on a fellowship being sponsored by the Open Society Institute, which is a foundation that was funded and run by George Soros and is committed to spreading the rule of law and open societies throughout the globe. One of the key indicators to be a fellow in this program, and specifically in the Palestinian Rule of Law program, is to be committed to the rule of law and the peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's an extremely prestigious and competitive fellowship. Those who are invited to join are actively engaged in facilitating the development of a rule in law, infrastructure in Palestine, a democratic civil society, and transparent institutions within Palestine. Not surprisingly, Ms. Shawaibi was selected for this because, indeed, she exemplifies such a person. She received her law degree with honors from Birzeit University in Ramallah and her LLM from the University of Michigan. She's particularly interested and engaged with issues involving women and the law, as well as international humanitarian law. In her past, she's not only been a student of gender and the law, international human rights, and humanitarian law, but she's also actively contributed and participated in a variety of institutions that seek to break barriers, facilitate reconciliation, and advance the rule of law in Palestine. So, for example, she's been a continuous contributor to an organization, Breaking Barriers, a Palestinian-Israeli organization that aims at reconciliation. She acted as a facilitator, for example, at a conflict resolution workshop between Israeli and Palestinian women. She's also participated in various youth conferences, one in particular, an international conference on youth and conflict entitled Youth Work in Contested Spaces, that was hosted by the Basque government and Northern Ireland. More recently, Ms. Chouabi has been working with the Open Society Institute in New York as a research intern in its Justice Initiative program, analyzing access to health care in pretrial detention primarily in Africa and in Eastern Europe. I had the pleasure to meet Ms. Chouabi last summer. I teach in the summer orientation program for the Open Society Institute, and she was one of the best and the brightest, not only of that summer, but of their program. Everyone could see the brilliant passion and commitment to justice that she embodies. And I considered it to be an honor and a privilege to have given her a basic introduction to the U.S. legal system. In her lecture today, she will focus on the issue of Palestinian women and the law. In particular, she will look at the human rights implications of pregnant Palestinian women who have been detained at checkpoints in Palestine. By focusing on the position of women in a conflict situation, Ms. Chouabi's lecture is particularly timely. Over the last decade or so, the international community has increasingly recognized that war and armed conflict have a particular and unique impact on women. We all know that entire communities are impacted by war, both in terms of social and economic status, health status, as well as political and socioeconomic status. Women and girls, though, are disproportionately and uniquely affected, as the United Nations and other groups have recognized, both because of their sex and their unequal position oftentimes in most societies, including our own. During war, women often become the symbolic bearers of political, ethnic, religious identity, and as a result are often the victims of abuse or mistreatment. As international law has begun to recognize the gender-specific impact of war and conflict, it's made gradual steps to expand the notion of human rights to incorporate the different ways that women often experience war. Unfortunately, women's experience in war often remains unnoticed or invisible, and throughout the globe, there is often a tendency to consider gender issues secondary or less important than the racial, political, or economic issues that are being played out during the conflict. So Hala's talk today is an important step toward foregrounding women's issues during war. Of course, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict raises complex issues, and many of us hold different views. But by focusing on issues of gender, we hope to advance the understanding both of women in war and of particularly the experience of Palestinian women. We are delighted to have her here with us to engage in this crucial dialogue. And so, without ado, I give you Hala Chouabi.
Good afternoon. Is it working? Yeah? Okay, I'll speak louder. First thing, I would like to thank you all for being here, for taking from your time to be here. As well, I would like to thank the law school and Professor Valerie for giving me this great opportunity. I will just give Valerie gave me a great introduction, maybe more than I deserve, but I will just add a few stuff on that. My interest in women's rights began since I was really, really young. I think it all started when after I was born in Jerusalem, then I moved to Saudi Arabia and lived there for 10 years. And I think it all began over there. Living in a society where I really felt there was no equality between men and women. And I think it all started there. Since then, growing up and moving back to Palestine, I realized that it still exists all over the Middle East, And even when I was traveling in many places around the world, I discovered that, oh, women do face discrimination in every part of the world. So this is how my interest began, and I even was more interested in women's rights than I was interested in general law. But that's how I ended up going to law school, since I only wanted to work on women's rights, and I had to study all other law stuff. However, which wasn't so bad either. However, in the last couple of years, in my final year in Birzeit University, where I studied law, I began noticing that I can't really focus on the conflict by itself and gender on itself, that they are integrated together, and that I should look at them from one perspective, as one whole issue. And then coming to University of Michigan to do my LLM, I decided to look more at this issue. So I took the course Gender and Conflict, International Humanitarian Law, International Human Rights Law, just to know more how can I combine the conflict and gender issues. So I'll give this very small introduction about the general Palestinian situation, just in case you need some refreshment or some more information about it. And I will show a few pictures. So this is a map of Palestine, or Palestine-Israel, before 1947, which was under the British Mandate. This is the map of the area, which is now, of course, Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. However, in 1947, there was the General Assembly in 1947, which issued a resolution that talks about this is where the first Israeli and Palestinian states' borders were issued. In 1947 partition plan. And then, however, things in reality were completely different. This was the original plan, but this is what actually happened in 1967, where Israel, as you can see, took more extra lands from the Palestinian. The Palestinian lands are the yellow ones, while Israel is this white one. So in 1967, this is how the map actually looked like. So the Palestinian lands were getting smaller, while the Israeli lands were getting bigger. However, now the situation is even much worse and very different. Now, in 2002, there was a separation wall that was built in Palestine. And of course, there are hundreds of checkpoints that are inside the Palestinian lands. This is one very major issue, that people think that the checkpoints are only separating Israeli lands from Palestinian lands. But that's unfortunately completely false. Actually, the checkpoints are actually inside the West Bank and we're in Gaza, now not anymore. But they're actually inside the West Bank. So they're actually separating Palestinian lands from Palestinian lands. And this is almost how the map looks like now. I think I have a more clearer one. Yes, so if we substitute Israel for water, and we substitute the wall and the checkpoints, this is how Palestine will look like. This is all the water over here, which is lands, actually, they're either settlements, or checkpoints, or the separation wall inside the West Bank. The wall, I'm sure some of you have heard about the separation wall. The separation wall was supposed to be built on 1967 lands to separate between Palestine and Israel. However, the wall is inside the lands of Palestinian as well, and it did take more lands from Palestine. This is a picture of the wall from one perspective. Okay. See, this is how actually the wall looks like in reality. So Palestinian lands can be inside, for example, they can be in the outside, and this would be Israeli lands. Although taking into consideration, sometimes this was all Palestinian lands. I mean, after 1967, this was all Palestinian lands. But the wall came exactly between many of the Palestinian lands and just separated people. And there is something very important, that a lot of students and employees now live on the other side of the wall, while their work and their schools are on the other side. And thus, to go to their schools and work, they would have to go through the wall. So how do they go through the wall? There is usually gates in the wall, and these gates open usually 2 times a day, one time in the morning and one time in the evening, to allow people to go through. And of course, you need permission in order to go through the wall, which is not very easy to obtain. So this is how it actually look like. People would be standing in line, waiting for a gate to be open, which is of course operated by Israeli soldiers, and they would either let you in or not. In certain circumstances, sometimes the gates never open. Or even if it does, there's a lot of people, as you can see, and people would have to seek alternative ways. And for example, this is one of the pictures that we daily see, which are people that would have to climb either like certain sectors of the wall that are smaller, or would have to go to alternative roads that might be very dangerous and might be very hard for older people, women, and children to go through. So this is just the general information about the wall. Now going more to the checkpoints. So in Palestine, in the West Bank actually, there are 613 closure obstacles. These closure obstacles include both checkpoints, which are 68 of them are staffed checkpoints with Israeli soldiers actually sitting there. 522 are unstaffed obstacles. So in many cases, there are only road barriers that are just sitting there and really impeding the lives of Palestinians and not allowing them to go through. As well, sometimes we have stuff that are called, like, out of these 522 unstaffed obstacles, they're usually what we call flying checkpoints. And those flying checkpoints are checkpoints that change position every few days. And so today it might be in a city beside Ramallah, for example, Bir Zayt, and tomorrow they might change it to, for example, 10 kilometers away from that checkpoint. So it really varies every day by day. However, just to let you know more about how does a checkpoint look like. So this is a typical checkpoint, actually. So checkpoints, usually people are not allowed to go through by cars unless they have permission. And this permission is usually obtained from the Israeli authorities. And in order to get this permission, usually it's either somebody who is in the government, who has some special relationships with the Israeli government, or in some cases, people who have certain commercial ties with Israel, which is very, very few, but still. So when they are allowed to go through, that's where they are allowed to go through. However, most people have to walk. So the actual thing, usually people have to go down from their cars and walk through something like this. And over here, when they reach the checkpoint, the Israeli soldiers, they have to give them, identification paper, and then by looking at this paper, they are either denied entry or allowed entry. And this is also sometimes, and as well sometimes, the checkpoint just closes. What I mean by closes, that nobody's allowed entry. And this was a very major problem in many cities in Palestine, in the West Bank, what I mean. So this really impeded the lives of Palestinians, especially, for example, in Ramallah. There was one major checkpoint in front of Bir Zayt University, which was the only university in Ramallah. So students had to walk every day for at least 10 to 15 minutes just to get to the university, to get to the other side, and then to take a taxi or a car to go to the university. So it really impedes the life of Palestinians in every way. I think I have another picture. Yeah, this is also how another checkpoint looks like. This is daily routine stuff to show that even whether children, women, unarmed people, like they're just normal people who try to go through the checkpoints. They're not soldiers. They're not armed. They're just normal people. For example, a lady, usually they do have permissions to go through, but also it doesn't always work. However, going now more into my topic, which I'm going to talk about today, which is giving birth at checkpoints. In April 2005, there was the first international attention towards actually women suffering on checkpoints. Unfortunately, before that, as Valerie indicated, women were not really noticed in the international arena in Palestine as that part of the conflict. They were just looked at as a general part of the population with no special attention to their needs. However, the Commission on Human Rights issued a resolution asking the United Nations High Commissioner to actually address the issue of Palestinians giving birth at checkpoints. Following that, a series of reports were actually issued by the High Commissioner on this issue. However, I don't know how, I don't think anybody even heard about those reports, unfortunately, even whether international lawyers or Palestinian people. Living in Palestine, I never heard about such reports until I really researched the subject, and they were actually not very easy to find. So, giving birth at checkpoint. Because of the checkpoints, 10% of women yearly are delayed. 10% of women who are going to hospitals to give birth are delayed. Moreover, they are delayed somewhere between 2 to 4 hours. Another 6% are delayed between 4 to 6 hours for the same journey. taking in consideration that Palestine is a rural area, and we don't have hospitals all around the West Bank. Hospitals are usually only in cities. And so in order to give birth in a hospital, you should move from your village or town and go to the city. This is why checkpoints really make it very hard for health issues, because in order to get to any hospital, you have to go through Israeli checkpoints. However, this had a major consequence on pregnant women. Between 2000 and 2007, 69 Palestinian women gave birth on checkpoints. 35 newborns died and 5 mothers. While these births have been documented, many others have not been documented. Taking into consideration the Palestinian context, many women who may have given birth at the checkpoint or en route to the hospital have not documented their child that was born and died at the same time. So the number, which is 69 women who have given birth at checkpoint, is actually, I'm not very sure how accurate this number is, because, as I said, there are many elements that play a role in minimizing this number. However, so how does this happen? How does a woman give birth at a checkpoint? Most of these women were denied entry. They were either in ambulances or they tried to walk on the checkpoint. Many of them who were in ambulances were asked to go down and walk on the checkpoint. As you saw in the other picture, they had to walk on the checkpoint. So many women, when they had to walk, they actually gave birth while walking. Others gave birth while waiting just to allow them to enter. However, others who were still inside the ambulance, they were stopped there for hours, and they gave birth inside the ambulances with no medical assistant. And this is why it resulted in 35 infants that died. However, also in other instances where the infants did not die or the mother did not die, the kids were born with very critical issues. And because there were no medical assistant, and the woman usually gave birth either by herself or if there was her husband or any family member helping her. And most of these cases were registered in the West Bank, because as you saw, all the checkpoints are most of the checkpoints are in the West Bank. However, being from Jerusalem doesn't mean that you will have a safer birth. For example, people who live in the villages around East Jerusalem should actually go to Jerusalem to give birth. And the only way they can go to Jerusalem is by obtaining a permission from the Israeli government. And they can only obtain it for 2 days. So they're giving permission for only 2 days. So these actually 9-month pregnant Palestinian women should go every 2 days to the Israeli government and ask for a new permission to go through the checkpoint, which is kind of a bit hard, I can imagine. However, in a study by the health department in Birzeit University, some data indicated that in 1999 there were only 8% of births that took place in Palestine, while in 2002 the home birth percentage rose from 8% to 33%. And it was said that one of the major reasons for this, that because women saw that it's getting harder to reach hospitals, and they would prefer to give birth in the house as long as they don't have to fear going through a checkpoint. And of course, this is also another major issue, because we don't have much care in small villages and towns in order to take care of those women and their children who might need some special attention. However, going back to the report of the High Commissioner, the High Commissioner issued a few reports, and it's in its final report, and unfortunately, the Israeli government didn't reply to any of the reports that the High Commissioner issued. In its final report in February 2009, the High Commissioner stated that the critical impact of the closure regime, including the walls, the roadblocks, the checkpoints, they do impair the fulfillment of the rights of everyone to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Furthermore, he stated that in certain circumstances, that actually the closure may amount to cruel and inhumane treatment according to Article 16 of the Convention Against Torture. So the High Commissioner here actually implied that there are certain circumstances where such closures may be torture. But unfortunately, he didn't say explicitly that giving childbirth on checkpoints is one of those critical situations. However, he did insist that the issue of Palestinian women giving birth at Israeli checkpoints should be understood within the context of the broader regime of the Israeli occupation and associated restrictions of movement. So he really insisted on the fact that this is part of a whole systematic plan of not allowing Palestine, of restricting Palestinian movements and really destructing their lives. However, now going to the international law perspective of this issue. So, Palestinian women, as I stated, gave birth on checkpoints in 69 cases which were documented. However, when looking at it from international perspective, there's an issue that faces Palestine. Palestine, as you know, which is the occupied Palestinian territories, is not a state. And in order to reach any international courts, we need a huge deal of issues, and that is basically very hard to obtain right now. However, I decided to write my paper on how can this giving birth at childbirth at checkpoints be actually a crime against humanity. And the only way that I found was the International Criminal Court, which is under Article 7 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Although this also needs more research of how Palestinians can actually go to the International Criminal Court. But this is something I think like somebody else would have to do, or maybe I would do in the future, and in order to know how would somebody seek the protection of international law. So in order for an act to qualify as a crime against humanity under the Rome Statute, it must obtain two kinds of elements: the general elements of crimes against humanity, and as well specific elements related to each crime. So the general elements of crimes against humanity are basically the presence of widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population. So I will discuss this issue. So in order to obtain a general element, this act should be widespread or systematic. In the case of the Palestinians, in the case of Palestinian women giving birth at checkpoints, they were taking into consideration that the Palestinian population in the West Bank is less than 2 million and a half. There's yearly 2,500 women that are delayed on the checkpoints. And as I said, taking into consideration that the Palestinian society is less than 2 million and a half, 2,500 does really make a major number in the Palestinian context. Moreover, Palestinian women have really created coping mechanisms in order to cope with these daily checkpoints. For example, Palestinians, it has been known that in the last month, in the last month of pregnancy, are delocating. They're going to live in cities just for the last month in order to have a safer pregnancy. So in order to think about this, so if let's say there are 10% of women who are delocating for another place, this means they are minimizing the effects of checkpoints. But however, it is critically affecting their lives. Moving to the city in the last month or in the last 2 weeks is critically affecting their situation, whether it was economically or their family relationships or any other obligations they might have. So taking all these factors into consideration, actually the number of Palestinian women that would have been affected by the checkpoints would have been much, much bigger. But unfortunately, regarding the fact that they have been dealing with this for so long, they have created all these mechanisms. So, in order to think, from an international perspective, this act may qualify as widespread, because as I indicated, 613 road obstacles is a huge number, and the fact that it's affecting all the civilian population of Palestine, especially Palestinian pregnant women, this indicates that such act is a widespread. And as most of you know, widespread doesn't mean it has to affect every Palestinian pregnant woman. It is enough that it affects a portion of women that it's really affecting their lives strongly and drastically. Is there any question before I go further, or should I just leave it till the end? Okay. So this is the first element. However, the second element is that it should be directed against the civilian population. So in determining the scope of civilians, in the case of women giving birth at checkpoints, none of the women in the documented cases were being part of an armed group or any actively participating in a hostile environment. As well, in international law courts, it has been indicated that the specific situation of the victim at the moment of the crime, that whether a population is a civilian or not, in indicating whether a population is a civilian or not, a court must consider the specific situation of the victim at the moment the crimes were committed, rather than his status. So in order for a woman to be a civilian, she should be at the moment of actually going through the checkpoint, a civilian that is not actively participating in any hostility. And this might make a person consider would really a woman, a 9-month pregnant woman going through labor, be hostilely active in that moment? So this is another way to prove that they are actually civilians, because none of the cases that were documented were said that the women were actively hostile, or even in that situation, especially when they were giving birth, they were, of course, not holding any hostilities toward the Israeli soldiers, or they were not trying to do anything that would affect the Israeli security. However, as well, other than these two general elements, there are some other specific elements that might be qualified. The specific element, the crime that I tried to prove, the crime against humanity that I tried to prove, was actually sexual violence. So in order for an act to be a crime against humanity, it should meet all the requirements of sexual violence. So what are the elements of sexual violence under the International Criminal Court? So in order for an act to be a sexual violence under the International Criminal Court, the act should have three major elements. What that is, the act must be of a sexual nature, committed against one or more person, and such conduct should be of gravity compared to other offenses under Article 7. And third one, that the perpetrator must be aware of the factual circumstances that establish such act. So these are the three elements that must be qualified in order to have a sexual violence crime under Crimes Against Humanity. So the first element that I'm going to discuss is aware of the perpetrator of the factual conditions. So in discussing whether Israeli soldiers were aware of the factual conditions that established the conduct, one might consider the fact that actually woman in labor is a tangible act, and that in fact it's an incident that can be seen and sensed. So a soldier. So in most of the childbirth that occurred, that were documented in checkpoints, the woman had already started labor in most of the cases, and they were in many cases visibly bleeding and in pain, and still they were denied pathway. In one case that I'm going to mention, which is a woman that was delayed for more than 1 hour, she was denied entry on the checkpoint. She was delayed for 1 hour, her and her husband, while they were trying to talk to them in Arabic and Hebrew, and trying to explain that the fact that the woman is actually in labor and going to have her baby in any time. However, the Israeli soldiers refused to let her through. And in the last moment, the woman just went and sat behind a concrete block in order to give birth there, so in order not to give birth in front of the people and in front of the Israeli soldiers. However, even then, the Israeli soldiers insisted that the woman should come and stand in front of them and not go hide behind the concrete block. However, when the Israeli soldier actually saw the woman giving birth, then he allowed the husband to go and bring a car. Before that, all the other indications, the woman and the husband were not allowed entry. So this makes us wonder, like, how really should the person be aware of the factual circumstances? Is it enough that the woman says she's in labor? Is it enough that the soldier sees the woman bleeding, or should he just wait until he sees the actual birth of the baby in order to let the woman in? So the fact that it was very obvious in these critical situations that the women were about to give birth or are actually in labor, the soldiers chose not to let them in. And thus, this is very obvious that the soldiers were aware of the factual conditions that made up this crime. However, regarding the second element, which is the gravity of the conduct, by considering the gravity of the conduct, it should be compared to other crimes committed, for example, international. We can look at other international courts and how they held, what did they held in such issues. For example, the ICT, the International Criminal Court of Tribunal for Rwanda, stated that an incident where a woman was undressed and actually forced to do gymnastics and naked in the public, this constituted a sexual violence crime under Crimes Against Humanity. So an act that where a woman was forced to be naked in front of people did constitute a sexual violence. So what about an act where a woman was actually forced to give birth in front of people and with no medical assistance? Wouldn't this also be constitute a sexual violence under Crimes Against Humanity? So this is how we can actually prove the second element. By going to other international, looking how other international tribunals held on this issue and seeing how they actually, less severe crimes were held sexual violence. So this is, they were held that they had the gravity enough to be sexual violence. So this indicates that such act can be actually held of gravity compared to other crimes. Finally, considering the last issue, the last element of sexual. The last element is that the act should be of sexual nature. Also, according to the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda, the court stated that sexual violence does not only occur does not only occur in the case of physical invasion of the body. It also refers to acts that do not involve penetration or any actually physical contact. Furthermore, the International Criminal Court commentary stated that the term sexual violence is used to describe any kind of violence carried out through sexual means or by targeting sexuality. So the point that I try to focus on here is by targeting sexuality. And since the ability to bear children has been so far only related to the female body, one can only assume that this is an attack on the sexuality of a woman. Since birth is only related to a woman, this is only a crime that can be committed against pregnant women. So one can only assume that such crime is targeting sexuality. However, this is like a small, brief analysis of how can actually such acts constitute crimes against humanity. However, as I said before, many issues will also interfere with how can Palestine actually bring a case in front of the International Criminal Court or any other court. As I said, since the occupied Palestinian territory is not a state and they don't have the they can't go to the ICC. However, I also want to mention a few things on the actual what the Palestinian organizations try to do. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of Palestinian organizations that do a lot of good stuff for Palestinian women, and they try to empower women, especially in different rural areas. However, very few of them work on the idea of the conflict and how does the conflict affect these women. I think the reason why this is happening is because usually it is much easier to work on internal issues and to touch such issues than working on combining the conflict and gender issues together. However, there are some organizations that work on women's prisoners' rights because unfortunately we do have some women in prison, and they are treated treated completely with disregard to international human rights or international law. These women they're not given any care for their gender, for any gender perspectives, for any gender issues they need. They are just treated, and as well, not only are they treated like as bad as the Palestinian men in prison, but also they are not given any consideration on any needs they want. And as well, in many prisons in Palestine, in Israel now, some women actually did have birth inside prisons. And these kids, in some cases, these kids will stay with the woman until they're 3 years old, and in other cases, the kid has to leave the prison after being 3 months. So this is a general introduction, I guess, about general information, I guess, about what's happening in Palestine. and related to the issue of giving birth at checkpoints. So I guess if anybody have any questions, I'm ready to answer.
Like it's individual and not concerted nature. How terrible it is, but it seems like it would be construed as individual acts by soldiers and not necessarily a concerted effort.
Well, in order for an act to be a crimes against humanity, there doesn't have to be a plan or a policy by the government. This is one thing that was indicated by the former, I think, by the International Court of the former Yugoslavia and the Rwandan one, that there shouldn't be a policy or a plan. It's enough to have a widespread or systematic attack. And this is one of the issues that, even though there is no plan, it can still constitute a crimes against humanity. I am trying to share this information, whether it was especially regarding this issue or regarding Palestinian issues in general. But usually there's a lot of problems facing Palestinians when they try to talk about their issue. And this is one problem that I'm facing, that usually people are not willing to listen a lot, or they just have their pre-thoughts ahead of time, and they're not willing to be open to listen to any other new ideas or any other new explanations. So. Well, mostly I have tried it in the U.S., but I did try it in Ireland, which was much, much easier. Where people were they were more willing to hear about the conflict. They were more willing to hear what the other side says. So, maybe. I think it's a global issue, though. Okay. I think it does have an effect of how it's being perceived, especially now talking about the Palestinian context. Palestinians they'd really feel it would have been different if a man would have done it, just because usually in our society, unfortunately, there is more, I don't know what's the right word to say, but usually more confidence is given to a report or a speech, especially about women, when a guy does it, because they know that he's not biased about it. But usually when it's a woman, unfortunately, there's always these other issues that we have to deal with. But it did affect me, being a woman did affect me to do this paper, but I think it did affect me in a positive way, not in a negative way, because being a woman makes me more connected to such issues and know how hard it can be, especially in a place where there's such a huge conflict and where women already are trying to obtain a lot of rights and ask for many rights, whether it was internally or externally. Actually, yes, there is. There is some men, I mean, not a lot of men, but there are some men in Palestine who are either really interested in women's rights or interested in, for example, in health rights in general. So they would be interested in such a thing. So yes, there are some men. Not as much as I want to, but...
Isn't
Of course.
it
So to answer your question, there is one issue that I tried to indicate in the beginning, which whether it was a separation fence or a separation wall, the issue of checkpoints is that it's actually, most of the checkpoints are not on the borders between Palestine and Israel. They are actually inside the West Bank. So the idea that like most Palestinians really get angry about and don't seem to understand is why there should be a checkpoint between, for example, Ramallah and the village next to it. How does this actually create a security issue for Israelis? I would understand having a checkpoint between Palestine and Israel, like in order to see who goes inside Israel or who goes inside Palestine. But why should it be between Palestinian villages and cities? Doesn't this really affect the Palestinian lives with no real security threat to Israel? So if I want to go to Nablus, why would I be a security issue to Israel? If I would go to Israel, I would understand why they would need to check my identification papers. And then regarding bombers who might be women as well. There is always this issue that some people say, why were there women who bombed themselves, which I think were two or three cases that bombed themselves inside Israel. However, I always don't like the idea that people think of women as the peace people, and men are the people who are warriors. And that's another issue. I think like whether you're a woman or a man, you can either be peaceful or you can be into war. So I don't think it's the issue of whether it was a woman who was going inside doing a bomb or it was a man. For the actual thing that I would understand, it was her choice. Whether it was her choice or his choice, it was just a person disregarding their sex.
A lot of other questions I could ask.
There's a reception after as well.
Quick question. So I'm just curious, you spoke of these different checkpoints, and I'm wondering whether or not a female having a male with her makes the process of crossing through easier. Is the process just
Actually, it makes the process harder when having a man, because men are treated much worse than women on checkpoints. So actually, when usually she has a man, things get more scarier. So that's another thing, that many times on checkpoints, the woman would rather go by herself than with her brother or her husband, just because, it's easier for her because she's a woman, she's a less of a security threat. So she would choose to go by herself. And that's how when she's denied access, she's totally by herself on the checkpoint with nobody to assist her.
In terms of establishing a general crime against humanity, I would anticipate that the Israelis, either the soldiers, would respond that they have a general policy of checking identification. It applies to everyone. And that pregnant women happen to sometimes get caught up in a system that is administratively ineffective, but that it is not a pattern or an action that targets pregnant women or even women generally. Do you see this as an impediment to establish? Is this correct that this is what they would argue, and is this an impediment to establishing that this is international precedent?
Actually, I do agree. They might give such an argument, but in order for a crime to be a crime against humanity, it can be looked at as a part of a bigger picture. So that's the thing, that it has to be widespread and systematic attack, but it can be part of the bigger attack. That's why I think one of the reasons when the High Commissioner for Human Rights stated that giving birth at checkpoints should be looked at within the whole situation in Palestine, Israel, and as part of restrictions of movement. So even if they do make such an argument, this argument can be actually articulated against, or we can see another way to go through this argument.
So do you argue then that the entire checkpoint system is itself a crime against humanity, and that this is sort of a sub-crime against humanity?
Well, that can be a way to argue it, but I think the reason why I didn't argue this, because this would be even harder to prove. It's easier usually to go to a smaller issue and just target that issue and focus on it. That's why I chose to go to such issue. However, I do believe, of course, that checkpoints are generally are crimes against humanity. That would be one way to pursue it, but I still think that just going to the idea that they are women who are giving birth in checkpoint is a crime against humanity by itself, it's much easier. And as well, taking into consideration the fact that there's a whole systematic plan by Israel to have checkpoints in the Palestinian lands. This is one thing. Actually, in my paper, this is something that I didn't talk about here. In my paper, I had two alternative roads. One which was sexual nature, and the other one was other inhumane acts. Under Article 7, there is also the last paragraph in it. There is the fact that there can be other inhumane acts which can constitute crimes against humanity. But the reason why I chose it to be sexual is just because from one perspective, I do admit that it was kind of easier to target because, since it's related to women's sexuality, it was much easier to prove that it was something regarded on childbirth. And also taking into consideration the situation in the area, as Palestinians, we feel that Israelis do have very big concern on, for example, because Palestinians have a lot of kids and a very big birth ratio. So we do feel as Palestinians that this is a concern for Israel. So for us, it's kind of a personal issue that we do feel they do target our sexuality. And something like this does feel for Palestinian women something targeting their sexuality.
One of the reasons I asked is because you gave us the example, or at least as an analogy, is the woman who's forced to do cartwheels naked, which seemed possibly different from this situation, depending on the motive of the soldiers at the checkpoint. So, for example, the motive of the soldiers at the checkpoint was to expose the woman in the act of giving birth, it seems to me that would be very similar. But if the motive is because the soldier is truly concerned that perhaps the woman is concealing a bomb, okay, I'm just assuming that were the motive of the soldier. It would seem that you wouldn't be able to prove, or maybe you would still be able to prove its sexual nature. So what would be your response to that? Or do you care what the motive of the soldier is?
I think that's the issue, that all international courts actually did prove, the Rwanda International Court really said that there is no, that it doesn't really care what the intent of the perpetrator was. So whether it was to, just to delay her or to check her ID actually, or just out of indifference towards the woman, it all doesn't really matter. By the end, the court would actually look at the fact what happened and what was the result of such issue, of such conduct, not on the intent of the perpetrator. You're welcome.
Hi, thank you for coming. I had a question about why you didn't speak about the Gaza situation, because it seems like the current stranglehold and embargo that the Israelis have placed upon Gaza raises a much graver concern, not only to Palestinians collectively, but in particular Palestinian women, especially pregnant Palestinian women.
Yeah, I completely agree. The situation in Gaza might be much more grave than this, but I mean, it's a personal issue that I chose to concentrate on one topic, which was childbirth at checkpoints, because, regarding my paper. But however, in Gaza, the thing is that because since Israel removed all the checkpoints from Gaza, this has been critical to my paper, so I couldn't really write about Gaza much. Before that, there were 14 cases of childbirth at checkpoints in Gaza. That was before Israel removed all the checkpoints from there. But after that, there weren't really childbirth at checkpoints. However, they do have a lot of problems, and one of them, especially if the woman or the baby needs any medical attention, there's no really medical attention in Gaza. No medical, there's not even enough doctors or enough medical treatment that they need. So in many cases, they are denied, even if they need to go, for example, to Jerusalem or to Egypt, they are denied this access.
Or perhaps because many Palestinians used to live within Israel and Palestinians still live within Israel, it may help your paper to argue that Gaza itself is one giant checkpoint.
That's another one. Thank you.
I was interested, just following up on that question, more broadly, can you talk about some of the other barriers or issues that women face in the context of health care in the
Sure.
occupied territories?
Sure. All I'll first thing talk about also related to childbirth. Another issue that these women face is that actually even when they do have a kind of safe childbirth, there is always the postnatal and the prenatal care for these women. There is in Palestine, in the occupied Palestinian territory, especially in Gaza, there is very, very little amounts of any medical attention that they can seek, actually. For example, in the last 2 years in Gaza, there have been any medical, whether they were medicine or whether there were sufficient doctors or sufficient treatments for the mother or for the infants. For example, in one case, that there were actually, when a baby is born, there's not enough incubators for infants to be put in order to live. So in many cases, if the baby is weak, unfortunately, he can't live because there's not enough medical attention for it. However, also women do face a lot of problems. For example, any vaccines that women need in the West Bank and in Gaza, there's a very great shortage. Of course, in Gaza, it's much more grief since of the last blockage that has happened there. And as well, other medical issues that face women over there is that we have a lack in medical staff. So this was one issue also regarding checkpoints, that even sometimes when some women do seek are in the hospital, whether for checkpoints or whether for childbirth or any other reason, there's usually not enough doctors there, whether they were delayed by checkpoints or just for the fact that there's not enough doctors in the West Bank and Gaza. As well, other health issues that women might face, other than, I'm trying to think the things that, because in general, it's a very weak there's very weak medical treatment in the West Bank. So that's why, for us, when we think about medical treatment, we don't really think about, great surgeries or, saving a person's lives. Usually, if a person is sick, he or she has really, very few hope of, living. So that's in general about women. Any other question? Yes.
Just to follow up, what about reproductive control or reproductive rights issues related to that?
So this is a Palestinian internal issues. Yeah. In Palestine, actually, in the last few years, there have been a very strong women's movement. It has been really, they have even tried to be part of the government. We do have a lot of women organizations that are actually drafting laws for the Palestinian Legislative Council in order to include gender issues in our daily laws. However, for reproductive issues, this is kind of a sensitive issue for Palestinians since the majority are Muslims. Or even the Christians who are there, they're usually conservative Christians. So in such a society, usually, for example, reproductive issues are looked at from a different perspective, that it shouldn't be controlled. Because, it's a gift from God, and this is one of the issues that we face. And that's why Palestinians have a lot of kids. And it's actually, in some cases, it's affecting us negatively. As I said, we have almost very few economic resources, and thus children are born with no chances in life. However, reproductive laws, I think now women's organizations are really trying hard to issue reproductive laws. But still, I'm not sure how strong they are. Especially in the last 2 years, they've tried really hard to work on, for example, the criminal law, gender issues in criminal law, or in the civil status law, much more than working in reproductive, because it's a very sensitive issue, and there will be a lot of blockade from the society in general. So I think this is a thing that might be looked at after finishing, for example, after going through the criminal law or civil status law and family law, then they would go to more health issues. So.
Sorry, I was trying to figure out when we came in, we were handed two things, a program guide and this handout, and I wondered what this related to your program.
Is it I didn't. I heard about it, but I didn't really.
So I don't know if those are things to address or if they're given as an alternative perspective or what the purpose of it.
Oh, actually, I just knew about this before I came in. That some student association gave this paper, so I didn't even read it. So.
I just was trying to figure out.
So first
female figure that Palestinians look up to, like a former Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan, or is there any figure like that, even one that's possibly actually guided there?
Actually, yes, there is. There is a woman who was part of the Palestinian Legislative Council, Hanan Ashrawi. I don't know if you know about her, but she's like the iconic Palestinian figure for us. She was also a minister, and now she's doing great work in Palestine, whether it was on gender issues or just in general. She's one of the strongest women in Palestine, and as well, she's very known for having unfortunately, most of the time, she's the only woman amongst men in many different issues. And now, actually, I just knew a few days ago that she's part now of the it's like a special section of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and she was elected to be one of the 6 members, which are all men, and she's the only woman to be there. So yeah, she's actually regarded as a very iconic figure for Palestinian women. You're welcome.
You never want to get their exercise.
You're up against what I would consider a terrorist state, which is Congress. But you're also up against an incredibly powerful, traditional Islamic force that probably disagrees with the life ethics. How in the world do you not get burned out? That doesn't even make any American.
I mean, the thing is that I try to deal with it. I'm not sure if in 10 years I'm not going to be burnt out. Hopefully not. But I guess the only thing is that when you see a little bit of improvement in the everyday life, that's the thing that keeps people going on. Like you actually do, especially in the internal Palestinian issues. Like, for example, we have a lot of critical issues regarding our criminal law that do not really treat women fairly. So in the last few years, there was actually a bill that was drafted by several women's rights and actually by several NGOs in Palestine, and that it was actually approved by almost everybody in the society, even by Islamic scholars. But unfortunately, because 49 members of the Palestinian Legislative Council are in prison, they can't meet. So the law has been sitting there. For 3 years. For example, this is like when this bill would actually become a legislation, this would be a very good improvement for Palestinian women. Yeah, most probably it won't, but I'm just hoping. I'm just hoping that it would, like, I also hope that that things like this would actually give hope more to the people themselves. So if the Palestinian people have still more hope, this means they're going to fight more and they're going to get more education and they're going to would want to argue other cases in front of international courts. So. Sure.
How does finances play into the checkpoints? And I just ask because I come from a place where, I mean, if you have enough money, you can pay your way through governmental checkpoints and things like that. And my other question is, are women punished by like Sharia law in Palestine or maybe in the Israeli borders for things that they do, or if they know that's the day they're giving birth and they come, are they punished for knowing or for not planning early?
You mean, are they punished in what sense?
Meaning, is there like any, I guess, does the government take any action for, like, say, for example, I know that I'm going to give birth next week and I wait until maybe 2 days beforehand to try to cross the border knowing that it might take 5 days. Are there any, like, conducts that maybe the government takes to, I guess, to try to make an example out of those women, to set an example that if you know you're going to give birth or you know that something's wrong with you or something's going on with you, get there early?
So first thing regarding your first question about like financing or like giving bribes, I thought you into this isn't actually the situation over there, because like in Palestine, Israel, there are two separate governments. There's the Israeli government, and then there is the Palestinian, which is not a government, but it governs the people at least. So these are two different identities, and actually it doesn't work by giving bribes to Israeli soldiers. It doesn't exist in the society's mentality. However, in the other one, which is Sharia law, also that doesn't exist at all, because first thing, and usually the government is the Palestinian government usually wants to help women, not to actually treat them bad or soldier. The Israeli government has no saying on women, like whether to go like 2 days ahead or 1 day ahead. And then on the other side, like usually women can't go a few days ahead to give birth, because usually they don't have any place to stay at. And regarding the very hard financial situation, they can't just go and stay there for like at the hospital or hotel like 2 days ahead or something.
You mentioned that many of the checkpoints are within the Palestinian borders, and that seems to be a lot easier. To someone else's question, so that you can almost understand having checkpoints at the borders to prevent, security concerns. And then following that, you mentioned that even with healthcare and things, the issue seems to be internalized in those Palestinian areas. So how do you suggest that you harmonize the security concerns of Israel? Because it would seem to me that a woman to get quality health care might have to leave the Palestinian territories. So how would you suggest that the issue is harmonized between the Israeli concern for the security interests, which you said that you kind of understand, with the issue that there may not be adequate health care, they may have to go outside of the borders.
Yeah, the thing is that usually when we say we understand why there are like checkpoints between Palestine and Israel, literally that's a compromise. Because this is what we've been doing for years, and we can understand what they would want to protect themselves. At least for the current situation or the current few years. However, for Palestinian women, anyways, even though there weren't checkpoints for the borders themselves, they are denied access inside Israel. So even if I want to go just to visit Israel, it's not a very easy thing to do. So actually the probability, the idea of getting inside Israel, whether with checkpoints or without checkpoints, there is the borders that you can't actually go inside Israel. And the way I see it, as long as there is going to be this, even the two-state solution in the future, if it ever happens, it's not going to be sufficient for the two people. There's always going to be these clashes between people. And as you mentioned, Palestinians would need a lot of help in order to obtain the right education and the right health system and a lot of infrastructure to be built. So this would necessarily need a lot of help from other countries in the area and from other aids. And as I said, it's not even an option to go inside Israel. So this is why, we don't usually think about it as an alternative for us.
And then my other follow-up would be, would that compromise the argument that these births are at the checkpoints? If the checkpoints really don't matter. If the checkpoints really are denying access into Israel, then would that kind of compromise the argument that these are crimes being committed at checkpoints against women?
Yeah, but
Regardless of the checkpoint, that same thing would happen.
Oh, but the checkpoints are actually inside the West Bank. They're not the checkpoints that are around. The Palestinians, when they seek childbirth, they're not seeking childbirth inside Israel. No, not at all. They're just living in villages in Palestine. And for example, they're living in villages around Nablus, and they just want to go to the city to have to give a normal childbirth. So it's not the issue of actually going inside Israel. So just putting Israel out of the picture, yes, it's a separate, it's exactly inside the West Bank. You have hundreds of broad barriers and checkpoints that actually don't allow the women to go through. So it's actually inside the West Bank. And even, most of them, most people, anyways, can go into Israel to seek health care over there. So
So it's just for health care, and then for health care they do have, they can get to.
yes, exactly. Yeah, they can.
To follow up on that,
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually one very important issue because many Palestinians before the second Intifada, the second uprising, were actually working inside Israel, and especially after the wall, it became really, really hard for Palestinians to go through. Of course, to work inside Israel, they need a special permission that they can obtain if they work there. However, going there became really, really hard for them. And of course, the financial situation became much worse. And that's an issue also in Gaza because many Gazans used to work inside Israel or do labor work for Israelis. So now, after they can't go there anymore, they have been facing really hard problems. And the unemployment rate in Gaza is somewhere more than 60% now. It's going really, really high in Gaza. And also in the West Bank. In the last few years, many guys, even guys and girls who graduate from universities, they're not finding any jobs. And that's why a lot of them are actually migrating outside. And this is also a problem for Palestinians. Because even if you go to school and you get a good degree, it doesn't mean you can have a good future there. Why? Because there is no resources. We are not allowed to have most of the resources. Even if there is not enough money in the country, there is not enough infrastructure, so we really need to build everything from the beginning. And the problem is that as long as we don't have movement of freedom, as long as we don't have enough water, enough resources, that's never going to happen. However, water is another issue in the whole Middle East in general. There's a critical water situation, whether in Israel or in the other Arab countries over there. But in Palestine especially, we have in the beginning, I don't remember the exact numbers, how much we should have had from the water reservoir from the sea and other areas, but all what I know that we don't get 80% of what we're supposed to have. So we have only 20% of our daily needs. And there was this interesting statistics that I read 3 days ago that said an Israeli cow has 300 cups of water per day, where a Palestinian human being has 30 cups of water per day. So this indicates how much water problems we have. For example, even in Ramallah, which is a city, which is not in a village, sometimes we don't get water for a whole week. We would get it just for 1 week, 1 day per week. So that's a very major issue for us, that it's affecting the people's life. Another issue, how it's affecting the people's life, is that Palestine is an agricultural country. And now, since we have no water, it's really impeding the people's life. Many farmers don't have any farms anymore, of course, whether they were confiscated or even when they still have their farms, they can't afford to have them anymore because they don't have any resource, they don't have the water in order to maintain their farms. So that's why water is a very critical issue in our area.
It's a very basic question. What is the security issue for Israel and checkpoints within the Palestinian regions?
That's actually what I was trying to say when I was wondering, when I answered the previous question, is why do they need checkpoints inside Palestine? Israel says that, they're trying to get more people, they're trying to to get more people and trying to know where people's movement and stuff, but that's not a security issue. A security issue would be only if they're trying to get inside Israel, and they're not when they're going to their work or to their schools. So that's another thing that I also always think about, or Palestinians wonder why do they need them inside the Palestinian lands.
Is there an official Israeli explanation for that?
Well, not really. Their only explanation is that they're trying to protect the security of Israel. What security exactly? We're really not sure. How does it affect their security? But that's usually the official thing, that their security, or usually sometimes they would say, oh, he belongs to Hamas, the Islamic movement, so just in case he does anything in the future. Or sometimes they would say, oh, we heard that these students in a university are up to some a certain demonstration or certain critical issues in the West Bank. So then they would go and put the checkpoints. But when you live there, you discover that's really not true, because checkpoints are in every few kilometers you would find a checkpoint, and that's not a security issue for Israel.
And then just on one last follow-up, one of the explanations I've read about the delay has been these suicide bombers. Have there been suicide bombers other than at borders? In other words, have there been suicide bombers internally? Internal, are almost all of them really between borders?
You mean suicide bomber, like, you mean so? You mean?
Explanation I can find on this, that, and I didn't look for very long, but is that Israel has a security interest, right? Now, which you've suggested is, well, what is that? And I've asked that question. What could that security interest be? So then, this is just a fact that we tend to say one way or the other. Do you know whether some of the bombings have been, I just don't know the answer to this, have they been mostly at actual checkpoints,
Yeah.
checkpoints, or internal?
Actually, the bombings don't usually happen on the checkpoints. The bombings happen inside Israel. So that's the issue. It's not on the checkpoints. Actually, Palestinians are very careful usually about doing any bombings or anything on internal checkpoints, especially, or even on border checkpoints. Because if they do, this would mean that the answer would be very bad the reaction would be very bad to other Palestinians, to the general Palestinians in general. So that's why usually bombings are inside Israel. And they, of course, and even if anything happens on the checkpoint, there's a very big possibility that all the casualties are going to be Palestinians, not Israelis.
Thank you for coming and bringing us this information. I have to say, this is the first I've ever even heard of this issue. And you talked at the beginning about the lack of the reporting in the media and how hard it is for me to find these reports. I wanted to see if I could get your opinion on why this is not something, it's a life and death issue, why it's not being covered in the media, and also what steps you're taking to get it covered, and maybe, for some of us who may be interested in the issue, what should people do, or what kind of steps do you think need to be taken to get more of this information?
Well, why is it not in the media? The only, for example, it differs from one country to the other, though. But you're right, something like this was not found. For example, because usually Palestinians or other Arabs, I'm talking to the Arab and European countries, which have very different media than the one that you see in America. Usually they're more concerned with the bigger picture. And that's a problem that we face with the media. They usually just look at the big picture without looking at especially what's happening to people, to people's everyday life. And that's a problem that we're facing with the media. Even Arab media, they're not really considering such issues. I don't know what's exactly the problem, but our perception is that they usually focus on the big picture, forgetting the details of the everyday people. However, still, we do hear many issues in the media. Maybe not, we didn't hear about the childbirth checkpoints, but we do hear much other stuff. But unfortunately, none of them, I can never hear any of them in America. And this is because the media is obviously, it's certain peoples have certain benefits, and they don't really want the whole world to see what's going on. And this is especially in the American media, because usually in Europe they have more of a, I wouldn't say not biased, but just much more better than America, much less biased than the American media. So that might be one of the issues that we are facing with the media. However, what I'm doing right now is that really our best bet as Palestinian now is the internet. Since it's the easiest way to get to people, it's the easiest way to get to normal people, not only just professors or lecturers or the academia, just, to everyday people, and to let them know what's going on. So the internet is now our basic source of information, or our basic way to let others know what's going on. And what steps that could be taken in order to let others know, I think this is something that we need to think about, whether as Palestinians or other humanitarians who are concerned about such issues. Whether maybe creating new newspapers or blogs or any other resources that we can really know how can we make sure that this news gets to all people around the world. So.
You mentioned earlier, you were talking about that Israel offers really no explanation as to the purpose of these checkpoints. It's kind of a vague security interest. Do you think this might be kind of a difficult question to answer, but in your opinion, do you think that this might be part of Israel, kind of like national security strategy to eliminate, to further erode Palestinian sovereignty and as a way, as a means toward achieving a greater Israel?
Actually, I do believe that. I do believe that most of the checkpoints, because they're inside the West Bank and they're not, as I said, there's no clear what is the security issues. They are really making Palestinian lives harder, and at the same time, there are Israelis who believe in the Greater Israel and who want to accomplish that. And that's also one problem with the two-state solution, that there's always going to be Palestinians who believe that the whole Palestine, Israel belongs to them, and there's always going to be Israelis who believe in the Greater Israel. So that's a problem that we're going to face anyways. So that's why I do believe that Israel does have a systematic plan in making life harder on Palestinians. And as I said earlier, many people who are getting good education are leaving the country because it gets really hard with their movement to find the right education or to even find a decent life in the occupied Palestinian territories.
Like everyone else has commented, it's really very interesting and more to the story. This is really more of a comment than a question, but I was thinking of what to do with what our next step is. Obviously, we're trying to gather data, bring this to light, and try to affect change. One thing I was thinking about was in the area of trade sanctions, which are legitimate and legal under international law. But in general consensus amongst nations that they should not be taken against populations, especially populations who are particularly restrained. So that we have, for example, trade sanctions against Iran, but the idea is that they're quote unquote smart sanctions. They're not. We don't have to throw all this country with the people of Iran and the world for government. And here you have a situation where you don't have sanctions. I guess it's internal, and yet you do have these actions which are really overtly, perhaps even in some cases unapologetically taken against individuals who are in the level of places. Did anybody try to use that as a justification, or as a justification against these actions, or changing these actions? I haven't seen it, but I wonder about that tact, since because we say this is bad, we say this is a problem. Fine. What next? Earlier commented when asked the question, what do we do next? What do we do with this? Is that a possible question? Thought about that?
So you mean a trade sanction against, I don't really get,
Well, they're analogizing trade sanctions, right? Which are deliberately not supposed to affect population, to these
Do-
activities, which are for security. Trade sanctions are too, right?
Yeah.
National security. If trade sanctions aren't targeted at individuals and populations, why on earth do we do it here?
I think that's the point. That's, as we said earlier, there's no real justification. And I don't think I ever even heard an analogy with trade sanctions, how does it not affect the people? But unfortunately, this is what's happening in reality. For example, in Gaza, it was a disaster for the whole people, and it's really affected and I'm actually, in our case, it affects the people more than the government, because to some extent, the government is there. And it did get affected, but still, America and Europe wanted Fatah to go back to the government, and they kind of did. It's out of our hands as Palestinians. But the people are the people who suffered. But what can we do? This is the issue that I've been trying to discuss with other Palestinians and even with other Israeli students, trying to know what can we do next? How can we educate people? And at the same time, what is going to be the solution for the future? And the only thing that we're getting there right now is that we really need more people to know about this issue. That's the first step. Because really people don't know what's happening over there. They have a certain idea, but they don't really grasp what's happening over there, or they don't even know how is it many things that are taken for granted over here. It's not even a dream for many people living in Palestine or any other countries in the world. So this is I think should be the first step, which is letting other people know what's exactly going on over here, talking about it and searching for further solutions. And this should actually happen between I believe in Palestinian and Israeli youth. This is the only way that can now something be achieved. You're welcome.
I want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks to the panel and everyone else who made this event possible, and to the audience for asking good
Thank you. Thank you.